Hey, welcome to the channel today. I was looking at another YouTuber, Catherine's film scoring. We do the same thing. She talks about how beginner mistakes are about really bad MIDI mockups, and she's completely correct on that. If I gave myself $1 for every terrible MIDI mockup I've heard, I'd be a millionaire. Even from really famous established composers will often, especially early in the MIDI mockup world. So this would have been in the early 2000s and the late 90s. There were still a lot of really big composers doing really not great MIDI mockups, and I've actually heard quite a few of them. But it was a different time where the expectation level was a lot different because people weren't expecting them to sound great. But now the bigger question is, does the MIDI mockup actually make it into the final version of the film? And more often than not, it does. Some form of it does. Whether the basics, it could be an ostinato or a drum pattern that has live instruments placed on top of it. It could be omnispheres that's used in the score, which is very often used. It could be many, many things. So this idea, I'm just going to adjust this, my little pop filter there. The idea that, I guess the idea I'm trying to say here is that your MIDI mockup needs to be insane. It needs to be great. It needs to always be good. And the first place that people screw things up is with the mix. That's the first thing people do. They're not thinking about the mix. They're not thinking about how the mix should sound. And I'm a big fan of mixing as you go. So pre-mixing for me is like a really important part of the whole mock-up procedure. And pre-mixing, of course, starts with having some kind of mastering plugin on top. Let's play. Let's see if we can get some notes here. We've got select an instrument would be good. Let's start with strings, because strings are always fun to start with. And we'll move these around. So we're going to select a string. And again, MIDI mockups, even for the best sample libraries out there, without any kind of reverberance or space, are going to not sound great, especially on string samples. And there are some exceptions to this, of course, but I think I've demonstrated this in previous videos. But when you grab strings and you go into the preset world of strings here, let me just find something. Let's use some violas. Violas are fun. Aren't they fun? Performance legato. It's not going to sound great. It just isn't. I mean, out of the box, it's going to be problematic. And if we go into advanced here and we look at the algorithmic reverb that's on, just adding a little bit of just in the actual plugin itself, the UI that comes with the instrument, there's usually a reverb. But more often than not, really bad. So if you're writing, for example, and not picking the right string articulations, but you're using something, for example, that's like you're trying to write an ostinato, but you're doing it with legato strings, and you're trying to write something quickly, it's going to sound terrible, even if you put reverb on it. So often the mistake that people make is not having enough knowledge of the particular articulation, especially as it relates to strings, that's going to work for tempo. Of course, slow. That's better than trying to do something like, and that sounds terrible. So again, you have to know this. This is really important. So let's talk about it. Going to turn off the algorithmic reverb, and I'm going to put on just a Space Designer reverb. So this is the reverb that comes with Logic. If you get the job, nobody's going to tell you if it sounds great. Oh, you're using Space Designer. Space Designer is a really great convolution reverb. And there are some really good halls to sort of start with. Grand Hall 2 is great. And that... that sounds better. For an active or for something shorter, for example, and let's get into the... Like, that's progress, you know? Like, that's progress. But again, without that reverb, the shorter notes, ugh, that's not good. That does not sound good. Let's key switch this down. There's also a little algorithmic reverb that's presetting on that. But even without it, it sounds terrible. So MIDI Mockup, first thing you do is you need to do a premix. And you need to really... anything. That's progress, that's progress. Too many ums today. Not enough coffee, too many ums. Shortbread cookies would be great. I've got them in the back. It's a lower carb kind of a day, though. So we got to be careful. Shout out to spirulina. It's a really great supplement to use if you're sitting in the chair all day. It's good for energy. Anyway, that's a little aside to what we're talking about here. We're talking about space. And I talk about it a lot. The most common question I get is, how do you mix string samples? You have to start with space. Space. Real simple, but it's going to inspire you to write differently if the sound is in an actual environment where it sounds decent. And I'm deliberately not using any of my real fancy reverbs today, just the ones that come with Logic, to illustrate how not difficult it is to make your MIDI mockup sound good. Now, another thing is pressure, expression, and velocity, and understanding how that affect of how you're playing, actually. I don't want to use, don't use, come on, stop it. How that affects the outcome as well. So when you're pressing a slight articulation versus a heavy one, it's going to change how things sound. Now I'm going to disable the key switching algorithm here, just so we can hear. That accent is going to have a real dramatic. I also have an expression pedal. So now we can combine the expression and velocity together, and you can get some really interesting affectations. And every sample library is going to behave very differently with input. Harshness. All of that, creating dynamic compositions, is something you can, of course, edit. But if you're playing it, it's going to really affect the overall sound of it. So it's important when you're deciding on approach is to mix as you're working. So pre-mixing as you're working. You notice I've got some mastering plugins on here already, and those are going to affect the overall sound of it. So if I pull this this back up, they all sound a little different. Even ones you don't think would work. Little sounds can be greatly impacted by what you're using in the mastering domain. So, again, figuring out a good that brings out the highs a little bit there. That affects things. It really affects the outcome. So I can't stress this enough in this workflow demonstration that if you don't bother to premix before you start, as you're adding instruments, your mockup's going to sound awful. It just is. I'm sorry, everybody. It just is. So you really have to make decisions about approach as you're doing this, as you're working. And again, this sample library is a great sample library, but it doesn't sound great if you don't actually understand space. And so a really great way to understand space, and I've done some explaining of this, is to go online and look at a live orchestra playing. And a really good example of this is some of the Berlin Philharmonic stuff from the 80s, where they're in the hall and it's just mic'd up beautifully and it sounds really good. That's partially due to the fact that it's in a space. That space really affects the outcome. So to compose without having things in a realistic environment, i.e. creating reverb, it's kind of reductionist to compose that way. You really want to hear how stuff's going to sound in an environment. And then you've got some really great ideas for creating dynamic compositions within the framework of your UI. And there's different ways of doing that, but one of the ways you can do that is simply going into, depending on which sample library you have, but going into this patch setting here, if you're using Vienna, and deciding, okay, we're going to take this Marcato idea and we're going to put it together with some other idea of maybe sustain, dynamic sustain, and we're going to crossfade those things together. And again, this is going to create a very interesting outcome as it relates to how this all works. Slot crossfade right here. And I've demonstrated this before. You know, combining maybe trying something here, for example, giving this a little bit more of an edge by putting maybe a détaché short in this cell, combining those two things, and then bringing those together. A little bit of a cello in there. Key switching is still on, of course. That's inspiring, you know, combining. I'm going to Shift R that. Where are you here? Shift R. There we go, because I liked that a lot, and I'm going to actually save that. I mean, that's what happens, you know, when you start building out a space, you start to come up with ideas almost subconsciously, and then it pushes you into a dimension of composing, you know. So these dimensions are created in your head when what you're hearing is sounding good. I mean, it's common sense, but common sense is not so common, as we know. So today, September 5th, I think. There we go. So that already meaning. I'm going to do some recording. Get rid of that. And then I'll do tempo analysis later. Whatever. I mean, it can be. Ideas start kind of coming out when you have these really nice sounds put together. So that's it. Have fun. Enjoy the weekend. Stay at home. Drink too much coffee. Write too much music. Have a great day.